So we're talking about not only system of slavery, but we're going to look at anti-slavery as well. That movement or movements within the broad category of those who were against slavery. Okay, we'll also have some review of the history of slavery in general, and then in particular in the United States. Um, and this is interesting because it causes us to realize that while we could put people in different categories, like if they were for or against slaveries, but they are different in their strategies or their reasons. And that is what layers history with complexity. It makes it more complicated than we usually think. Not everybody who was against slavery was against it for the reasons that we might think when we first hear that. But let's talk about slavery and then see how this moves us toward the Civil War. So we've talked about this before, and this will be some review, but slavery is an ancient institution common to all cultures. That's the first thing to give us perspective on slavery in order to understand it. What it is and how common it was. That slavery was seen to be the expected norm. It was just a way of life all over the world for all times in different conditions, and it was seen as a normal thing, not a good thing, not people wanting to be part of it. And it doesn't mean that it was not an injustice. It was an injustice. That being said, this developments over time had to change in order to create an environment where slavery being brought to an end was not only a possibility, but was a change in thinking that had to take place as well. Today in the West, people are not morally for slavery, at least chattel slavery. On the other hand, most people didn't think that way throughout most of history, that slavery was something that was normal and common. Most people throughout human history have lived at near starvation level, and slavery was to be expected. It's only in the last 200 to 300 years where we really, and really only in the last 150, where we start to see a major change in thinking. So you could become a slave many different ways: through insolvent debt, through owing somebody money and having to pay it off, which is still around today, obviously, debt. But you could become a slave that way. You could sell yourself into slavery. You could sell children into slavery. You could sell other people into slavery in order to pay off debt. You could be sold into slavery by your parents. Now, this could be an act of direct cruelty, but it also could be an act of desperation as well. If you were a parent who could not afford to feed your children, that you're at the level of starvation and you can't keep yourself and them alive, a terrible choice that you may have to think through in that condition is selling your own children into slavery as a matter of survival. Now, there may be cruelty, there may be injustice, all those things are present. It's usually hardly ever one thing, but this was common in ancient times. People could also be losers in a war. You lose a war is very common to become enslaved. Now, this is horrific, but even slavery itself was a development that started taking place in the practice of war and conquering. That rather than just annihilating and killing everyone, slavery became an alternative to that practice. And, if given a choice, would people rather be slaughtered by a conquering army or enslaved? Right? Now, there is the element of choice is removed from it. That's the point. But the conquerors realized that they could get other benefits of slavery rather than just killing everybody. So, as well. The other way to become a slave is you could be kidnapped by slave raiders, that you could be kidnapped, taken by people who plan to sell you into slavery. That was the original case for people in the United States, was that they were kidnapped, brought here. And that starts developing in the early 1600s, but it doesn't, but kidnapping from Africa and the advanced slave trade takes some time before it becomes really feasible to have that type of slavery in North America. There were also people who were kidnapped from Ireland and England who were poor, who were brought in during this time as well, were kidnapped slaves. They called them sometimes indentured servants, which had times where people were more voluntarily bringing themselves into that system, but other times they were kidnapped peoples. So this has happened all over the world for thousands of years as well. This practice of being captured by slave raiders and sold into slavery. The word slave comes from the word Slav, which is referring to the Slavic or the Northeastern European people who were conquered so much in history that the name Slav is where we get our English word slave. And so Slavic, or the fact that they were conquered so much and became slaves so much, the word Slav, it became synonymous, a synonym for being a slave. There was slavery off the Barbary Coast. They were pirates, would capture people from the Barbary Coast. They would actually go up from the Barbary Coast here on this map and capture people from Europe and take them back down into the upper northern coast of Africa, take them eastward, and then sell them in areas over here, kind of in the Middle East, to modern Middle East and the Muslim world, and the areas on the way through the upper north area of Africa. So North Africa's Barbary Coast, sometimes they're called the Barbary Pirates during this time, alone, just this one group, captured, and I put "and" there twice, and enslaved at least 1 million Europeans. So there were people taking people from Europe and selling them in other places in the world as well. This was a common practice. Terrible thing, horrible injustice, just as all slavery is, but it was normal. It was to be expected. People had to watch out for pirates because you could be taken and sold into slavery. Interestingly, there were actually more Europeans captured into slavery in North Africa than Africans brought to the North American and British colonies. Now, most people don't know that. You would think that slavery was only taking place in the West and in the United States and in Europe and things like that. And it was taking place there. But in terms of just the sheer numbers, there were several million Europeans being captured into slavery in other places in the world as well. Europeans were actually still held in slavery in the Islamic world over here years after slavery ended in the United States. So slavery was still taking place and is still taking place in the world back then, but even many times in the world today, the destabilization of Libya, which is right here, in the Obama administration's presidency, the Libyan government was run by a dictator named Gaddafi. Okay. The Americans encouraged and supported, not the Americans, the American government, the US government encouraged and supported the overthrow of that government and did drone strikes and things like that. The problem, now that sounds good in a sense, and that's kind of why they chose to do it. But the problem with that is even though they overthrew a really bad guy and encouraged that and started helping and sending money and arms and weapons and things, was they were giving money to these people and arms and weapons to people who were really bad warlords and people who were going to fight with each other now to take over the region. And this is why you also have a migrant crisis in Europe, is you have a lot of people fleeing this country now in a terrible civil war and going into Europe and somewhat into the United States as well, because this whole region was destabilized in that time. How this connects to what I'm talking about now with slavery is that one of the terrible things that has happened there as a result is that the slave market has been reopened in Libya. Warring sides capture one another and sell each other into slavery. And so it's a whole terrible mess there in Libya today. But in the modern world today, the slave market has been reopened in the country of Libya. So anyway, that's a kind of connection between today and back then. Olaudah Equiano was an African who was captured as a slave. Now, he's a hugely important person in many ways because he is the only person who was kidnapped as a slave that we know about who was able to learn English and write about it in a first-person autobiographical perspective. And so his document, The Interesting Narrative of Olaudah Equiano, his book, his autobiography, explains what it was like to be captured and on a slave ship. Now, he's hugely important in the anti-slavery movement in England. He later became free. He later became a Christian and wrote this book, but he created through this book an awareness of what slavery was actually doing to people, to fellow human beings. And this was a powerful argument that touched the heart of people, that not only showed that slavery was bad economically, slavery was bad, it was unjust, slavery is bad logically, all these things, but he got into people's minds and imaginations and hearts by writing simply his experience and the cruelty that he experienced. And this started to move Britain toward the ending of the slave trade, the actual business of kidnapping people and selling them into slavery, that was propped up and enforced by the British government and other governments as well. So he wrote what it was like to come across on what was called the Middle Passage. And the Middle Passage is the trade where slaves were captured. Well, they were slaves once they were captured, but people were captured into slavery on the west coast of Africa here. And then they had to cross this Atlantic Ocean. And the route that they took came to be known as the Middle Passage. And he kind of writes of the horror and the experience of those things as well. Now, most slaves, you can see here a little bit, it's not as clear because the picture is a bit small, but most slaves were taken in terms of numbers down into South and Central America, the West Indies. A few, 0.3 million, were taken to Europe. Europe didn't have as much slavery because it didn't have the agricultural and kind of land to be worked at the same level as kind of the quote unquote New World did. And then about 3 million were taken to the United States during this period of 1650 to 1860. So that's where it's taking place from. So, and then it's also interesting to think about how South America and Central America, down on this continent, dealt with ending slavery, bringing slavery to an end. So there's some interesting things to learn from that as well. We'll finish up here with just looking at a little bit of what we looked at last time. The sermon from the Christian minister, Alexander MacLeod, where he titled it Negro Slavery Unjustifiable. That basically he was making the point in New York in 1802, which would have had slaves at that time, and been engaging in the slave trade. So the trade is the actual business of selling slaves. The slavery itself is the act of forced labor after someone has been sold. And so he makes this case from the Old Testament text of Exodus 21 that says, he who kidnaps or steals a man, whether he sells him or he is found in his possession, he shall surely be put to death. So he says, look, in the Old Testament, this had the death penalty for it because it was an act against a human being, fellow human being, that you couldn't just make right by, okay, yeah, I kidnapped you, I'll just pay you some money. No, it took seriously, and it had the death penalty with it. So he argues that man stealing, kidnapping, is against the ideals of biblical Christianity. Okay. Now, there were a lot of people arguing for slavery as well, and the matter of how the Bible handles slavery is a little bit more complicated than just a pro or con. That being said, there were people making arguments against it, and there were people making arguments for it. So Christian anti-slavery itself had different perspectives within it for what and why, but his argument is fairly simple, that it's against God's law, it's against God's word, it's against our fellow human beings who are made in the image of God, and therefore it cannot be acceptable or pleasing to God. That's his argument. Okay, so people used the Bible to justify and condemn slavery. Okay, so there's uses on both sides. He said here from the text, I consider myself authorized to lay before you the following proposition, his main point. He says, the practice of buying, holding, or selling our unoffending fellow creatures as slaves is immoral. So that's it. He says that's his main point, and he's going to continue to make his argument from there. So slavery and anti-slavery is fairly broad and complicated, and we'll see next time a little bit more of the kind of contributions from different groups and their strategies for how they thought slavery could come to an end, because there were different opinions and different reasons why people were against slavery and why people were for slavery. There were people who may be against slavery in theory, but didn't see how you could really bring it to an end. I mean, how do you get the whole society to change its mind on something? There were some people who had a strategy, okay, well, we can end slavery, but that doesn't necessarily mean that former slaves are going to get the right to vote or things like that, right? There were the ideas of, okay, well, can former slaves, if we did free them, can we live together in peace and harmony? Right? So there were the ideas of, okay, maybe people who could be freed from slaves and sent somewhere. This is one of the ideas that comes out. It's, James Madison, who we've looked at, president, father of the Constitution, was part of that idea. And Abraham Lincoln, president, was thought through that idea as well. Kind of interesting thing with that position, while we may think, okay, well, that sounds very foreign to us today, even post-segregation and civil rights, is that position, lots of colleges, universities, businesses, lots of places are now trying to create a separate and safe space for people of color or whatever the case may be. But we can think through that a little bit, with our knowledge of history and say, okay, well, is it, even if it's trying to be nice or helpful, even if that's the reason behind it, is it really a good idea to say you have to go somewhere else or to separate people? And I'm just asking the question. Okay, I'm just not making a value judgment on those things. I'm just saying that it's something worth thinking about a little bit. That is it really the idea that we should send people to a separate place because we assume that people cannot safely and peacefully get along with one another, right? That's something that we'll have to think about. Okay, but next time, and then there were positions like the abolitionists who thought that slavery needed to end right now, and that slave holders needed to be not only not compensated, not paid for the ending of slavery, but punished. And they were willing to actually break up the United States in order to, as a strategy to try to bring slavery to an end. It's an interesting position. So that being said, we will end that there with some things to think about. But basically, if you were in the time period where everybody pretty much accepted slavery as normal, as a necessary evil, as something that would be very difficult to deal with, or even a lot of people thought that slavery was good, how would you try to bring slavery to an end if you were alive back then? Something to think about, and then we'll look at what people did try and kind of their measures of success.